South African exporters are under pressure after the United States has imposed a 30% tariff on key goods, from citrus and wine to auto components. We have Nezo Sobekwa, an economist in country risk at the Export Credit Insurance Corporation in South Africa, or the ECIC, in the studio to discuss the fallout and whether this crisis could force a rethink of South Africa's export strategy. Hi, Nezo. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for having me, and good day to all of your viewers, or afternoon, wherever they're listening from, or evening. Happy to be here.
Well, now that the 30% tariffs are in effect, what's the real impact on South African exports?
Well, Linda, the impact is multifold. In the first instance, we do know that there has been an exclusion in terms of the tariffs on those minerals that are considered key for U.S. manufacturing. And so we note that, for instance, our magnesium, our chrome, etc., have been excluded from that list because the U.S. finds them to be key ingredients. The real impact then hits our automotives industry, which has not really felt the full wrath of the 30% tariff. They're really at about 25%, but that has had a negative impact nonetheless. Moreover, it's the citrus industry that in the Cape, the wine industry, agricultural products that really have felt the full wrath of the tariff implementations. The other issues have also been around the fact that in anticipation for the impact on the tariffs, there's been a lot of stockpiling, and that has caused some industry value chains to be obscured in the short term, creating some risks in terms of stockpiling. It's also meant that there's had to be a serious acceleration of trying to find alternative markets, I think, naturally, for some of the products that will not be able to be renegotiated. We also do know that we've got the AGOA tariff agreement coming up soon, and I believe that's on the 25th of this month. And we are unaware of how that's going to look, as it is a unilateral agreement. And we do know that South Africa has enjoyed quite a lot of market penetration in the US in terms of an asymmetrical market penetration from that. And that would also have negative impacts, particularly on textile industries, as the automobiles industry as well. The US has been the consumer. It's been the third biggest consumer of South African exports after China and Germany, and so it would have a negative impact. The current forecasts in terms of its overall impact on the GDP sits at about 2%, and so if South Africa's current GDP forecast is just shy of 1% growth year on year, most economists put it at about 0.8%. We sit at about 0.7%. It would mean that really the impact would put our growth at about 0.5% on average year on year.
Well, are some of these exporters hoping that a trade deal might actually materialize?
Yes, I think that the South African government and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition have understood the importance of ensuring that the negotiations take place. And the South African government has got quite a number of strengths under which to negotiate with. I think the practical and pragmatic approach that the US government is taking doesn't leave South African export markets on the back foot, nor the negotiation capacity on the back foot. The ability to negotiate based on the minerals that are necessary is a really good footing. But it's also worth noting that the US benefits substantially from the South African market, and that at face value asymmetries that seem to be there based on the preferential access of South African goods into the US are reciprocated in other ways, where the South African government is concerned and where the South Africa Inc. is concerned. So that AGOA agreement with the US, for instance, also turns at least 8,000 jobs in the USA in the automotive industry. And there are various other benefits that kind of balance out what seems to be an asymmetry in market access, including taking advantage of a really robust financial system within the South African market that allows American companies, over 300 of them, to use South Africa as a springboard into the rest of the continent. And this allows for all sorts of other technical expertise and capacities into other mineral regions that are going to be necessary for the American economy, where things like energy security is concerned, and the like. And so they are really hard benefits, and there are also softer benefits that need to be taken into account. And so, no, I don't think that the negotiations are necessarily going to be as negative as some might see at face value. I think the South African government has got really strong footing in this area for an amicable and reciprocal negotiation outcome.
From what I hear in Washington is that there is actually something really good on the table, but the problem is political. It's not what the economic picture that you just painted, really good picture that you just painted. There are some political gives that they want. Could this be an impediment?
Well, Linda, the economy is never divorced from the political sphere. Such is the nature of all international political economic realities. And, my remit is really around the economic diversification and capacity of the South African government. I have full confidence, having said that, though, that those political differences in a multipolar world will find common ground. It makes sense that the political and economic formation of the BRICS would create some political tensions in terms of geopolitical drivers. And all of those geopolitical drivers will always have an impact on the strength of negotiations. What the South African government has done, and I think has done well, is sit on the pragmatic side of these political differences and ensure that their national interest is put first as opposed to geopolitical alignment. And so I'm confident that that pragmatic approach will do well in terms of the economic outcomes moving forward. They've navigated really well in other areas that were geopolitically tense, to say the very least, in recent times.
So what is the ECIC doing to cushion exporters from this import tax or the tariffs?
Well, the ECIC has got quite a number of products and quite a number of offerings that it has come into agreement with the DTIC to assist local exporters as well as commercial banks to ensure that they are cushioned. One of which is, for instance, to extend better interest rates and lower coverage rates in terms of our premiums where South African exporters are concerned, in order to cushion the impact. But also the ECIC is engaged and is mandated to find alternative markets through on-the-ground work. We are on the continent. We have partnerships with other partners, and we do country scoping exercises to look at the economic opportunities for various sectors and for various industries. But that notwithstanding, in support of the negotiations with the DTIC and the US, the ECIC is giving really good insurance coverage and lower premiums to assist with ensuring that whatever knocks were taken as a result of heightened import taxes and tariffs into the US don't spill completely over to the exporters, and that it is still a commercially viable exercise to export into this very important market of the United States.
So if we're talking about pivoting to other markets, which markets are you talking about?
Not necessarily in this particular context of the tariff negotiations, but as a general mandate of the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, our work is to ensure that we continuously find alternative markets for the growing industries in South Africa and sectors. And so when there is a global shock of this nature, that work becomes all the much more prominent in being expedited in order to ensure that we look at those external markets. But to answer your question more directly, we have been looking at Mauritius, we have been looking at emerging economies that look to be having really good GDP growth over the next coming years, like Zambia, of course, Cote d'Ivoire. We know that Namibia is doing well, particularly because of the dual investments, both in minerals, where lithium is concerned, and renewable energy as a result, but also the oil fields that have been found in South Africa having a comparative advantage in the minerals and mining space, as well as in the fuel, gas, and petroleum space. Those are some of the areas in which we would look to. Of course, in the agricultural space, South Africa has had really good trade relations with a number of European and developing states. So we are looking to increase some of our exports and divert them into those particular markets. We know that, for instance, countries like Mauritius have got a re-export port terminal facility that allows South Africans to then piggyback of their really good geopolitical positioning to find markets in the Far East, so Taiwan, Indonesia, I beg your pardon, Vietnam, etc., are also areas that become open to South African exports. Of course, China is always going to be a noteworthy export destination because they consume so much of the world's minerals, and South Africa having so many mineral deposits, some of those could be going in that way. We know geopolitically that what the Chinese did in response to what the US government did was drop all import tariffs in favor for the continent of Africa. And it is because of that competitive tension between those two. And that would then definitely open up that market for South African exports.
So would they be able to pivot quick enough, these companies that are exporting to these destinations you've been talking about?
Of course not. And the South African government, being aware of that, has also put together a fund to cushion the value chain transitions. You would, I think, as you've rightly pointed out, note that value chains don't change overnight. Contracts, shipping routes, the investments that have been made, particularly when they are physical investments, so factories, etc., and processing plants, that will take quite a bit of time. And when it's an unprofitable value chain, to then pivot into another value chain that may be more profitable would require some cushioning, and government has been prudent and proactive in supplying South African exporters and lenders with the financing necessary for that.
Well, earlier you mentioned AGOA, and there seems to be a resignation in South Africa that would not be renewed for South Africa. Do you agree?
Well, I tend not to agree. Of course, it's very hard to know what it is going to look like because this sits purely in the remit of the United States government. Senate sits and decides whether or not it will renew AGOA, and it will look at a number of variables. And so if we were to look at it purely analytically, and looking at the net impact of AGOA, the net impact for the United States is also positive, particularly when you look at the fact that we've got American investments, particularly in the automotive sector, that benefits from the AGOA agreement. So if you look at the Ford plant in Tshwane, for instance, that allows for Ford to put together its cars and export them through South Africa to other markets, that is a really good deal for the American government. But you must also remember that there's also the petroleum investment of Sasol in the US, and many other levers that I think would allow the South African diplomatic corps to negotiate in AGOA, albeit different, perhaps even more reciprocal, perhaps not as asymmetrical as it is, but certainly one that would still allow for lowered tariffs between the two nations to continue in strategic sectors for both nations.
Well, many countries are now talking about engaging with Africa, specifically when it comes to critical minerals. And what role do you play on the African continent to make sure that political risk is not such a big problem for these companies who want to come into Africa?
Well, Linda, this is precisely where we come in. Because we sit on the continent and because we've been doing business on the continent for the past over 20 years, as a de-risking entity for commercial investments as well as for trade finance, commercial lenders, we are able to take a number of political heads of cover, convertibility and transfer risks, particularly where there are African countries that may have really weak currencies or depreciating currencies as a result, perhaps at times of political issues, or the global economic environment and the shocks that cannot be helped. We are able to take on the insurance of that to ensure that you are able to get your money out of a country if you ever invested or put your money into a country. We are also able to cover terrorism, sabotage, particularly in high conflict zones, to ensure that whatever your investment is or whatever your trade deal is, if it is impacted by any bouts of conflict on the continent, that you are sufficiently covered in terms of your commercial viability. We also take on other political risks, so regulatory environments. If a government comes in that's different from another government, and even if there is a military government. I mean, if you look at the Sahel at the moment, we know that those governments are military government and not civilian government, and the risk of regulatory differences can be high. And yet there are commercial opportunities. Yet those Sahelian countries are exporting the minerals and are ensuring that their economic diversification goes through and are ensuring that businesses thrive. And it is important for us understanding the risk perception, understanding the ratings of these sovereigns and how it is that they are being downgraded as a result of sometimes very legitimate instances, that we are able to de-risk those for investors, because those countries are coming from low bases, and that really is where the opportunities are. And of course, if you look at the global debt situation, we do know that African countries are taking on more and more debt and are excluded from the capital finance market and are unable, therefore, to develop and socially spend. And so we also help African governments to de-risk any of their development projects with private developers and commercial lenders by taking on the sovereign default risk, where sovereign may not be able to pay. The ECIC will be there to pay, and we've done so. If you look at Ghana, which did default, all of our clients were not affected by that because the ECIC did cover them when there was a sovereign default as a result of global economic shocks.
Do you have other examples of projects you are involved in?
Oh yes. So in Angola, we are busy engaging the government with a number of projects. I cannot go into the details of those here, but they sit in a number of development areas. Angola is ramping up its development, having come out of the previous wars and civil wars, and then having been hit by COVID and having to have slowed down on it with infrastructure development. We are helping to de-risk all sorts of projects there, because Angola has never defaulted but is under some fiscal pressure, and so we go in with a number of project sponsors and lenders in road infrastructure development, in water development, and to name just a few areas. Renewable energy is now an area that is ramping up, especially because the continent has struggled with the electrification and and power pools, and so we are also taking on a number of projects there. In fact, there are opportunities for renewable power projects in Zimbabwe that we are looking at, which is seen as an incredibly high risk area. But the ECIC's expertise have ensured that a number of really good projects have taken place. One of which that we are incredibly proud of is, of course, the Bight Bridge renewal, which allows for it's the port for the biggest amount of commodities traffic on the continent, moving down to Durban, which is the biggest port on the continent for exports. So everything that comes from Zambia, the DRC, Tanzania, you name it, would go through that Zimbabwean Bight Bridge road. And despite the economic sanctions and despite the economic difficulties for the Zimbabwean sovereign, we were able to de-risk that kind of project and ensure that African commodities make it to the rest of the world. So those are some of the projects that are coming up and some of the ones that we've taken on in highly risky environments.
Nezo Sobekwa, thank you so much. It's always so nice to hear your views.
Thank you very much for having me, Linda, and I'm looking forward to further engagements.